Buongiorno a tutti, vi ringrazio di essere qui.
Thank you all, and thank you for being here. First of all, I'll have to thank my colleague Claire Daly, who supported this initiative, and she followed throughout all the steps this initiative, and she made this room available. And I would like to thank Stefania Ascari, MEP from Italy, from the Committee Against Mafia, and we have fought together for freedom and justice. She's very active and a very good representative in Italy fighting for freedom and justice. I would like to thank Cohen Ruvers. He's a representative for the Ombudsman Office, very important for the European Union, monitoring institutions and promoting good administration. He's working on transparency and on revolving doors. So he's a qualified expert to give a contribution to this event. We will present today a research to build monitoring organization and a body inside the European Union. This activity has already been proposed and promoted, but was not concretely created yet. So the aim of this research is to see how this authority can be efficient, because it is useless to have an authority if then it cannot be efficiently used. This is just another tool that will be overlapping with other tools and other authorities already existing. We will have to understand how it can be more efficient, and I now present the author of this study and the journal of the University of Wollongong in Australia. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, and he worked on the main issues for the creation of this European authority, the main aspects that are relevant to make this body more efficient. He has worked against the conflict of interests in many parts of the world, including South Korea. And then Jeff Ozer, he's the director of Revolving Doors Washington, and he has been working in the US. He's comparing the different experiences that they had in the United States and how to avoid failures, as we have seen in the US. And then Mr. Alemanno, has been studying at the Institute of Jean Monnet. He has a PhD, and he has been working on the legislative side. How can this authority can be rightly implemented at the European level? And then we have another part of our project. We are trying to create a website, Stop Revolving Doors. This is a platform where we would like to see all your suggestions, ideas, notification, and opinions from NGOs and others that are already working on revolving doors. This might be helpful for citizens to find useful information and see how we can detect cases of revolving doors. We have collaborated with 2 NGO. We would like to remind you that NGO have been working a lot on revolving doors up until now, so we would like to thank them all for their work. We have tried to make this link between the politics and the political world and the institutions and all the other authorities. And we have another colleague here, Wendy Agatnaglu, from the Transparency Task Force, and Shari Indus from Transparency International. Thank you for being here. And I would like to thank my cooperators, those who have helped me to hold this event, thanks to Jacopo Simonelli and Ebbe Citelli and Luca Ponti. Why are we talking today about revolving doors? What are revolving doors, first of all? Well, mainly, these are cases when the people who were holding relevant mandates at the European level, once they ended their career, they start working in other lobbies. Or another case might be that of someone working for some lobbies and then becoming a commissioner, and then after that mandate going back to their lobbies. When they are in the institution, are they working for the citizens or for the lobbies that are giving them money for that? It is not an easy task, because, well, of course, institutions can have a commissioner, someone who is an expert coming from a specific sector, even if it is a private sector, because we need someone with experience. And at the end of the mandate, they can go back to their previous job. But we need to find rules so that this path is not that easy. And in the private sector, we have it. We have already these type of rules. You cannot go from one company to the other. We need rules in the public sector as well. It's a matter of transparency. Also because these will somehow undermine the trust citizens have in the institutions, because we might lose the prestige an institution might have. I think that this is an issue that should be more of a priority for us and for citizens. So I'll leave the floor to my colleagues. I'll start with Stefania Scari, and then we will go on with the other speakers. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. I would like to thank you all, and thank you, Sabrina Pignadoli. It is a great honor to be here with you today. I would like to thank her for the incredible job she has and what she has been doing so far in the institution. It is very important for us in the Italian for us in the Italian Parliament. She is really important for us. I would like to thank all the other speakers here today. It's a pleasure to meet them and learn from them, from their projects that we might want to repeat in Italy as well. Trying to regulate conflict of interests and revolving doors, and how this can be interesting for citizens. It is very important for democracy as well. When we think about ministers or prime minister or a member of parliament talking to the private companies, it is important for us to check integrity, democracy, and the state is under pressure to favor private interests. In Italy, revolving doors is not violating and infringing the law. As mentioned in 2015 in a report by transparency.org, there is no unique rule in Italy to avoid this revolving door trend for not in the public sector nor in the private sector. In Italy, our legislative framework is lagging behind, and we have seen politicians, high-level politicians, going from private and public job and have been paid as lobbyists to put pressure on the new employer. Since 1976, we've tried to present a draft proposal with 96 being proposed so far. In the last government, the draft proposal was approved in the chamber, but was not approved in the Senate. Just to give you some concrete examples with high-level politicians, the last example was that of new Minister of Defense in the government of the Prime Minister Meloni. Mr. Crosetto was the president of IAT, representing Italian companies in the defense sector, the aerospace and safety, and ship-owning company for military ships technology. In the press, they said that his links and relationship might have an influence on the decision he might take as a minister. Just a few months ago, he was just representing the interest of those companies. When speaking to the Ministry of Defense, as a minister now himself, he would have to decide who to give the access to those resources. We want to remind you that in 2022, Mr. Crosetto said, and I quote, "I will not go to the Ministry of Defense because it will not be appropriate because of what I do." But he changed later on, and he then accepted to be the minister. Well, of course, this is all legal. I want to remind you that. Another example, Pier Carlo Padoan, another Minister of Economy from 2014-2018, a member of the Budget Committee in the Chamber until 2020, and that same year he became, after he resigned as an MP, the president of the bank UniCredit. As the Minister of Economy, he was in charge of many of the documents that were classified documents. So being the president in a private entity might undermine the free competition, but it's legal as well. And another example I would like to give here, Marco Minniti, the Minister of Interior Affairs from 2016-2018, member of the Foreign Affairs Committee until 2021, when he resigned to become the president of the Meadow Foundation, the foundation that is linked to the military technologies Leonardo. Well, saying that this is not quite appropriate, of course, we are not attacking individually these people. We are just trying to defend public integrity. The civil servant has a sort of relationship and links he or she has been creating during his or her mandate. And it is very important to remind that they have an influence. We have tried to propose many draft laws, including the activity of lobbying. That law was approved in the chamber but refused in the Senate. What does it say? Well, for competition and the free market, we will need an authority to monitor on these. We have proposed a register with all the list, with all the stakeholders, with all their relationships and meetings, and a cooling period, at least 2 years. And during that time, members of the government, advisors, and MPs cannot have a private job in private companies. These draft laws has already been proposed. I hope this will be discussed and then approved with the Next Generation EU. The European Union has created one of the most important program for support and aid for the countries. So we have so many stakeholders at the moment that are interested in this money. We need to do our best to avoid this and this vulnerability for the democracy. I would like to thank Sabrina and for these research project, and I hope that we will define these legislation as soon as possible. Thank you.
Yes. Dear Member of the European Parliament, Pignadoli, dear elected representatives present, dear representatives of academia and civil society, thank you so much for your kind invitation to the European Ombudsman to contribute to this important discussion. The revolving door issue is a priority for the European Ombudsman, and we have carried out a number of inquiries into this topic during her mandate. And I, as an inquiries officer, have been involved in conducting these inquiries. If revolving door situations are not handled properly, they risk undermining the work of the EU administration by subjecting it to undue influence. This also carries a serious reputational risk for the EU as a whole. In general, the EU has already strict revolving door rules in place, so the legal framework is there. But these rules must be applied properly to be effective. It is important to show that civil servants have a long-term commitment to the public good, and that jobs in the EU are not seen as a stepping stone to more lucrative positions in the private sector. There appears to be an underestimation of the corrosive effect of officials bringing their knowledge and networks to related areas in the private sector. That is so for temporary public office holders and for those who were career civil servants. The European Parliament's 2021 resolution on strengthening transparency and integrity in the EU institutions by setting up an independent EU ethics body mentioned the joint inquiry that the European Ombudsman conducted based on complaints from EU civil servants, academics and civil society into the Commission's handling of a former Commission President's move to an investment bank. As a result of that inquiry, the Commission strengthened its code of conduct for commissioners. The notification period for former commissioners were lengthened and the rules on declarations of financial interest tightened. The assessments of commissioners' post-term employment requests are made public proactively. So all of these things are improvements. The Ombudsman furthermore concluded inquiries into revolving door cases of executives and high-level officials at the European Banking Authority, the European Defence Agency, and the European Investment Bank. And in the contribution of the previous speaker, we heard how the defense sector can be a very sensitive area for former officials to move into, and I've got an example of that in this contribution too. The Ombudsman also conducted own initiative systemic inquiries into the approach to revolving door moves of middle rank and senior staff members of the European Commission and the European Central Bank. One inquiry regarding the handling of a move of a former high-level official from the European Investment Bank is still ongoing. I will briefly set out the outcomes of the inquiries that are closed, and at the end of this contribution, I will also say a few words about a possible future independent ethics body. So first, as regards systemic inquiries. Former public officials have a fundamental right to engage in work after their service ends. However, this right must be balanced against the risks that any such moves may pose to the interests of the EU institution and the public interest. This is particularly important for potential moves by high-ranking public officials. The Ombudsman recently completed 2 systemic inquiries, namely with the Commission and the ECB, or the European Central Bank. The Ombudsman concluded that these institutions should adopt a more robust approach to dealing with problematic revolving door moves. When they consider that a request to take up an activity poses risks that cannot be adequately mitigated by restrictions, or when restrictions cannot be effectively monitored or enforced, they should temporarily forbid such moves. The Ombudsman made suggestions that are aimed at improving accountability and transparency of the approach to the revolving door, which can be important tools to improve monitoring and possibly, by extension, enforcement. The Commission has replied to these suggestions, the ECB not yet. So I'll now set out some of the developments at the level of the European Commission. So in the context of this inquiry, we inspected 100 files on post-service activities of former staff, in total 80, and external activities of staff on unpaid leave, in total 20 decisions. The inspection suggested that the Commission was quite reluctant to forbid activities when they did pose risks. Of the 100 files we inspected, the Commission prohibited 2 activities. The Ombudsman, for example, suggested that the Commission, at a minimum, requires former staff members to submit evidence that they shared the restrictions imposed with their new employers. The Commission did not commit to this minimum standard, saying that it explicitly requests former staff members to share, where necessary, imposed restrictions with a new employer and or their clients, but it doesn't ask for evidence that that has indeed happened. In cases of high risk of reputational damage, the Commission is considering imposing on former staff members a condition of periodical reporting on the compliance with restrictions to enhance the accountability, which is welcome. In line with a suggestion from the Ombudsman, the Commission will make public its annual report on new jobs of former senior Commission officials that may involve lobbying up to a year earlier to enable greater public scrutiny. The possibility of scrutiny of decisions can arguably also create a deterrent effect, as it puts greater pressure on former officials to respect them. The Commission is also considering making public parts of decisions on post-service activities of former senior officials earlier, in case questions on the mitigating measures are raised in public. Commission staff on unpaid leave who want to work in the private sector face a stricter approach in relation to law firms, consultancies and lobby groups. The Commission now, in principle, rejects requests for such jobs from staff on unpaid leave when they aim at representing private interests against the Commission. And that's a change of policy that happened after the European Ombudsman opened her inquiry. I'll now say a few words about inquiries into the handling of individual cases, and I need to maybe specify that the European Ombudsman does not investigate the actions of individuals, but she investigates the actions of institutions dealing with requests from individuals. So we look at the practice of the institutions. The latest of such individual cases concerned a former Management Committee member and Vice President of the European Investment Bank. The European Ombudsman concluded that the EIB did not properly manage the risk of conflicts of interest which arose from the request of the former Vice President to take up a position with a company in the former Vice President's constituency during her cooling off period. For example, the EIB did not check when the former Management Committee member and Vice President had received the job offer, which was all the more important given that the request followed shortly after the end of her mandate. However, as the EIB made improvements to the relevant rules after the Ombudsman had opened her inquiry, the Ombudsman closed the case with the conclusion that no further inquiries were justified at that stage. In terms of EU agencies, The European Ombudsman has concluded revolving door inquiries into the moves of executives from the European Defence Agency and the European Banking Authority to related jobs in the private sector. First, as regards the European Defence Agency, the Ombudsman found that the EDA should have not allowed their chief executive to become a strategic advisor at a major defence and security company only months after departure, and that was on conflicts of interest grounds. The restrictions that the EDA imposed were insufficient when measured against the risks of lobbying, and they could also not be credibly monitored and enforced. The Ombudsman recommended that in the future the EDA should forbid senior staff from taking up positions where there is a clear conflict of interest. It should also set out criteria for forbidding such moves and inform any applicants for senior posts about these criteria. The EDA agreed to implementing these recommendations. The European Banking Authority. There was a very high-profile case there, and it concerned its former executive director, who became the CEO of a trade association for the wholesale financial markets. This inquiry was triggered by a complaint from a coalition of civil society organizations, which highlights the public interest in this topic. Given that this move to a finance lobby group from an executive agency charged with devising rules to regulate and supervise European banks, the Ombudsman regarded this as a textbook case of an activity that should have been forbidden, even if restrictions were applied. If this type of move does not justify the use of the option to forbid an activity after leaving, no move could. In addition to finding that the EBA should not have allowed this activity, the Ombudsman also found that they did not immediately put in place sufficient internal safeguards to protect confidential information when the planned move became clear. The Ombudsman recommended that the EBA should, first, be more ready to invoke the option of forbidding certain activities in the future. Second, to set out criteria to forbid such moves and inform applicants to senior EBA posts of these criteria when they apply. And third, to put in place internal procedures to ensure staff moving to another job no longer have access to sensitive information. The Ombudsman commended the EBA for responding very positively to all of her recommendations. The EBA said it would forbid senior staff from taking up certain positions after leaving the agency. And in a show of commitment, it prohibited its former executive director from taking up another post in the private sector shortly after the Ombudsman had made her findings. The EBA also adopted a new policy for addressing post-employment restrictions and prohibitions for staff. It further put in place procedures to immediately suspend access to confidential information for staff known to be moving to another job. Other EU institutions and agencies can draw on the EBA's new safeguards when revising their own rules. As a result of the Ombudsman's inquiries and those of a wide coalition of actors, including in Parliament, there is arguably far wider awareness of potential problems caused by revolving door cases. Now, I conclude with a few words on the independent ethics body. The mandate of such a body may include post-employment and post-mandate activities of EU representatives and staff. While we have been part of a consultation process by the Commission, the European Ombudsman has no formal role in the negotiations on the creation of a new EU independent ethics body. Administrative matters related to the future independent ethics body would fall within the Ombudsman's mandate. Although many open questions arguably remain on how such a body may work, the Ombudsman welcomes any attempt to improve accountability in this area. I thank you for your attention.
Dopo questo primo quadro generale,
After this overview, I will now be giving the floor to the authors of this study so that they can tell us about what they have found. And I will start with Andy Shmulov. Thank you very much.
To be invited back here, and indeed it has been a great honour for me to work on this report with colleagues as eminent as my co-authors, Mr. Hauser from the Revolving Door Project in Washington, and the very eminent and renowned Professor Alamano. And so too it has been a great privilege for me to work with the staff in Signora Pinodali's office, whose personal integrity and commitment to the highest standards of ethics have not failed to impress me, and I acknowledge that fulsomely and with great gratitude. We have been asked to prepare a white paper on this resolution, and we have done so, and I stress that we did so with remuneration. The headline result of our findings is that this proposal, in our view, represents a global benchmark, one of the most comprehensive and excellent proposals I have seen for an oversight authority anywhere. I won't be discussing the findings in detail because those are in the report and they're available for you to read. Instead, what I would like to do is I would like to put our research findings into context. So let me start with the background. My focus is on the operationalization of oversight authorities, not the need. Certainly my research into the operationalization of these mechanisms is grounded in the need, but my focus is not on the need, because I think that that is a debate that has been well and truly settled. So the problem is not the need for oversight authorities. The problem is that they are addressed so often, but so often without effect. This is the challenge. How do you make an oversight authority effective? And I want to explain the problem and the challenge by way of a metaphor. Combating corruption, conflicts of interest, and the revolving door finds a suitable metaphor in a dam wall. I'd like you to picture, if you will, the biggest, the thickest, the highest, the most impressive dam wall imaginable. A dam wall so high that you feel a sense of vertigo standing at the bottom looking up, let alone standing at the top looking down. The wall is gigantic. It is bombastic in its qualities. Behind the wall lies a lake, so vast and so deep that at its deepest point light itself cannot penetrate the depths. The lake and the wall are in constant, ceaseless, unrelenting conflict. The conflict does not relent even for a moment of time so brief that it can only be measured at a subatomic level. In waging that conflict, the lake does not hurl tidal waves at the wall, great walls of water, the purpose of which is to smash the wall down. No. Instead, at the place where the conflict takes place, that is the interface between the lake and the wall, the lake touches the wall. It feels it. It feels every individual molecule. It sniffs it. It tastes it. It probes the wall. It tests unrelentingly for a weakness until it finds just one crack. And when the lake finds that crack, it doesn't hurl tidal waves against it, trying to smash the crack into a chasm. Instead, what it does is it sends forth an emissary, just one drop. And it pushes and pushes and pushes until it squeezes that drop into the crack. And when it's done so, it lines up the next drop. And so the process continues until water pours through the crack. Now, I should mention my metaphor is grounded in reality. Every large concrete structure whose purpose it is to hold back water, whether they be dam walls or undersea tunnels, all of them develop cracks. All of them leak. Leaking is inevitable. And so if the leaks are not repaired, then you may be assured that the lake will always win. So let me apply this metaphor to the proposal that we have before us. corruption, conflicts of interest, the revolving door is the lake. No matter what steps you take, no matter how hard you try, no matter how high and thick the wall, corruption is unrelenting. It searches, it tests, it probes, it tastes, it sniffs to find just one crack, just one opportunity to circumvent, to undermine, to penetrate your defences. So what you have here in this outstanding proposal for an EU Ethics Oversight Authority, a proposal which in our opinion is a global benchmark for an oversight authority, is you have an excellent beginning. In that regard, I am deeply, and I stress deeply, impressed by the totalistic, the holistic, the expansive, the foresightful, the wise approach taken to the individual components in this proposal, like, for example, length of board tenure, board composition, fit and proper requirements that board members must satisfy, all of which create a massive, impressive dam wall. But from here, the real work begins, finding and repairing cracks, finding and repairing the gaps, gaps in which those who seek to make personal gains will find opportunities to undermine, to subvert, to suborn this effort. And so let me say this, and I hope my words will ring in your ears. If you go looking for cracks and you don't find any, then you know you were not looking hard enough. To put it differently, in respect of where you are with this resolution and how far you've come, but also how far you have yet to go, let me quote the words of Sir Winston Churchill. This is not the beginning of the end. It is merely the end of the beginning. I'd like to add a postscript, if I may. It is with much regret that I must express my disappointment. In drafting this white paper, we, of course, paid close attention to the European Commission's response. And here I had the inescapable sense that the Commission was throwing whatever obstacles and whatever counter-arguments it could find at the proposal, irrespective of whether those counter-arguments were valid. I refer to one example, the use of the Moroni Doctrine. I'll leave the detailed analysis to my esteemed colleague, Professor Alamano, whose reputation in this field is unparalleled. But both he and Professor Simonetti at Luis University in Italy dispatched the Moroni Doctrine with ease. As the Moroni Doctrine has been in force since the late 1950s, I would expect the Commission to know and realise that it was not relevant. This example, and there are others, smacks of an ideological and institutional entrenchment of a position. That in turn, in my opinion, is ultra vires the Commission's power and remit, and fails to serve the citizenry and undermines the EU project. And so I use this opportunity also to call upon the Commission to engage in an honest degree of introspection, to approach the prospect of an EU Ethics Oversight Authority with fresh eyes, with a renewed focus, and dare I say it, with an enhanced degree of integrity and a commitment to the highest ethical standards. Thank you for your time.
Andiamo avanti con...
Let's move on. You decide who wants to go first.
Andy, I want to express my gratitude for Sabrina and bringing us in, her staff. Oh, sorry. I'd like to express my gratitude for Sabrina and her staff for graciously bringing us in and commissioning us on this project. The project was very rewarding, working with my colleagues on the stage with me. The issue of the revolving door is, like many things, particularly bad in America. Traveling abroad as an American in the past decade has been an opportunity to be embarrassed on behalf of my home country. In the past, the U.S. arguably excelled at many things, but now we perhaps are unparalleled in our embarrassment and honestly our political corruption. And that's ironic because I think if you looked at advances made in the United States in the late 1960s and through the middle of the 1970s, you saw a country that was beginning to take issues of political corruption very seriously. But as Andy was describing in terms of his metaphor, the efforts of the United States and civil society in America to address ethics concerns have eroded very badly over the past half a century. And the spirit of reform is in need of renewal and revitalization. And there are some promising developments in that regard, but much more is to be done. Many of the issues we face, therefore, in 2020s are about how wildly out of date America's ethics laws are. In the 1970s, there was a sense of disenchantment and cynicism with the U.S. government. This was involving the Vietnam War and, of course, the presidency of Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon was not just associated with a break-in at the Watergate Hotel, but a series of wild campaign finance scandals and other violations of the law and basic decency. And the response was vigorous, the response was bipartisan, and there was a sense of triumph in America that these issues had been addressed. And the laws that were put in place reflected the understanding that existed in the 1970s about how politics could be corrupted. There was a focus on lobbyists, and there was a sense that we've kind of created the right system in place. But in the subsequent decades, legal challenges and the normalization of evasive action by corporate America, again, normalized by both the courts and by society, has eroded that system. What happened? What allowed the 1970s reforms to be squandered? For one thing, the civil service movement for ethics reform became very technical, very dry, very boring. It became very bureaucratic, and that process of civil society groups being boring broke the connection between reform advocates and the broader public. So you lost any sort of political momentum for ethics reform. Enforcement mechanisms that were put in place were too weak at the time of being put in place and have grown weaker over time. Again, consider the metaphor that Andy provided earlier. The system very much relied on career civil servants to be able to stand up to America's political elite. That has not gone well, and it's only getting worse in the United States. It is very difficult for civil servants in the United States, who are somewhat weaker in their position than in Europe, to stand up to political elites who are shameless. But I don't think that the threat of political elites who are shameless is entirely unique to the United States. So I do think people in the European Union need to fear for such phenomena occurring here as well. as I mentioned, the loopholes have become gaping chasms, and the legalistic response is just inadequate. The result is that in America, cynicism is rampant. There's a view that everyone is corrupt, and so novel corruption is not viewed as that big a deal, because once you assume everyone's corrupt, a new example of corruption doesn't shock you. So it's very important to convey that things can get better. And we have to both make that true, but we have to get to the place in which it is not assumed that all politics are corrupt. Now, I mean, the result of this rampant cynicism is that the US government is not trusted on issues from vaccinations to how to address the climate crisis. There are real political consequences to rampant cynicism, and that cynicism is what good ethics laws and good ethics enforcement are intended to prevent. Trump's presidency renewed interest in ethics laws, but it also made them more partisan than they should be, or that they were in the 1970s. There are some promising exceptions, but a systematic updating of US ethics laws is not imminent. Corporate influence makes reforms difficult anywhere. That's not just an American challenge. But there are some challenges in the US that are greater than here in the European Union, and therefore offer some hope. America's polarized two-party political system and the requirement that two branches of Congress agree with the president to make a change in law creates many veto points. And when a scandal is associated with a member of one political party or an element within one political party, that political party nowadays in the United States will likely rally around their politician rather than agree to reform. And so basically anything Trump did that was wrong, Republicans are inclined to say is not wrong because Trump did it. Hopefully that is not the case in Europe. But what are some of the principles and lessons from the Revolving Door Project's work in the United States that could be applicable here? One is that dividing up ethics enforcement is dangerous. American enforcement system is endlessly complex. There are multiple congressional enforcers of ethics. There are inspectors general across the executive branch. There are separately lawyers in each and every agency and department of the federal government that have ethics responsibility. There is just so many people with some responsibility. And the end result is that when many people are supposed to have responsibility, in the end, no one really has responsibility. There's little to no evidence that the people who conduct enforcement share information, not with the public, but with each other. What information is made available by government is scattered and makes civil society's work and the media's work more challenging. People developing expertise in enforcement have no mechanism to make recommendations on rules to address loopholes public. So you learn a lot when you're enforcing a law. Those are the people who become the experts in what does and does not work within the law, and their views in the United States are not heard. There's no official institution that anchors the enforcement or conversation about ethics in the United States. There's no equivalent, no meaningful equivalent of an ombudsman. And so it's very difficult to generate attention and help civil society and the broader public understand when a situation is exceptional. Essentially, the key business lobbies in the United States and in Washington, D.C. are extremely well organized. Ethics enforcement is very disorganized. The next principle is that we need to maximize the independence of enforcement. The Office of Government Ethics is the office within the U.S. government that sounds by its title like it must be the central hub. And they had a terrific head of their office when Donald Trump took office. Unfortunately, he was subject to being fired, but in the end, Donald Trump did not need to fire Walter Schaub. because Walter Schaub lacked the authority to actually create meaningful problems for Donald Trump. And so in the end, after heroic efforts to shame the unshameable Donald Trump, Walter Schaub instead resigned, which was all he could do. My conclusion is that shame is a very overrated enforcement mechanism. Next, enforcement staff cannot be subject to the management by the political staff who they are monitoring. They cannot be subject to promotion decisions, bonuses. In the United States, each cabinet level department and agency have their own ethics staff. They are in touch with the Office of Government Ethics, but they don't answer to them. They instead answer to the bosses, the political bosses within their department. Promotion decisions are made by the political officers. We saw that in the case of Donald Trump's Secretary of Commerce, this guy Wilbur Ross, who got bizarre ethics waivers to continue businesses in international shipping while he was the Secretary of Commerce. And the person who gave him those waivers to allow him to continue ownership got a promotion from Wilbur Ross. So that doesn't work. The Federal Reserve in the United States, I know there have been some issues here with the European Central Bank. The Federal Reserve in the United States had a series of scandals during the pandemic. Essentially, senior officials of the Federal Reserve, both the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., as well as regional bank presidents across the country, were engaging in active trading while they were intervening in the U.S. economy on a daily basis during the height of the pandemic. That behavior is outrageous. Two regional bank presidents were eventually compelled to resign, although they were not the only bank presidents to engage in unethical behavior. The investigation into their activity continues, but is continued in secret and is moving very slowly. Separate trades made by Chairman Powell and then Vice Chair Richard Clarida ended up with a report that kind of in a conclusory way said nothing was done wrong here. We have filed a series of Freedom of Information Act requests to figure out what happened, but the results were entirely unsatisfactory. But people said, well, this was done by the Inspector General at the Federal Reserve. The Inspector General must be independent. But the Federal Reserve Inspector General is chosen by the Federal Reserve and can be removed by the Federal Reserve, which doesn't, meet most definitions of the concept of independent. And our conclusion is that you're never going to be able to trust the results of ethics enforcement when people are reporting to the people who they have to judge. But even an independent enforcement staff is not a guarantee of effectiveness if the ultimate deciding body is partisan. We see that in Congress, where unethical behavior is judged by a committee that is evenly divided between the two political parties. So any political figure who's in good standing with their party has essential freedom to do whatever they want. And we've seen that in the executive branch, where the Inspector General of the Federal Trade Commission found that a former commissioner had been illegally lobbying the Federal Trade Commission on behalf of a big tech company. They referred Josh Wright, the former commissioner, to the Justice Department for prosecution, and the Justice Department under William Barr, Donald Trump's Attorney General, he just let it go. Complex rules are also very difficult to enforce. We would strongly recommend clear rules whenever possible. That reduces the complexity of the task. It can increase the speed of enforcement, and it could potentially help address any concerns about delegation. Tailoring rules for specific circumstances is dangerous. There's also a tendency for staff under pressure to try to reach accommodation with political appointees for recusal or for exceptions to be made. We would recommend that the norm be that exceptions are not made. Again, simpler rules without exception are more readily enforced. And we also think it's very important that there be adequate levels of staffing. If you want to enforce the law, you need enough people to enforce it. And we need, because essentially we need that everyone to know that ethics laws will be enforced. That's the only way you're going to create a norm of acting in an ethical matter. It has to be expected that you will be prosecuted, you will be sanctioned if you violate ethics laws. We need to address the cynicism that is abundant in the United States, and I believe increasingly abundant in the European Union. And I think the only way to do that is clear rules that are enforced independently by empowered ethics staff. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to share a few remarks coming or based on our report. I'm also grateful to Sabrina and her team for creating the opportunity to advance our conversation on how to improve the European integrity system, and of course to my co-authors for the fruitful collaboration. As you have heard, and this is the perspective that comes today also from the member states, in this case from Italy, what we do in Brussels, the system we set up in Brussels when it comes to ensuring the integrity of our political leaders and policymakers represent a benchmark for what happens at the national level. And this explains why what we're discussing today is so important, because historically, European standards for integrity have been, in average, well above the standards applicable at the national level. My perspective today is that of a researcher who has been, over the last 20 years, work on transparency, integrity issue at the European level, but also the founder of an organization called the Good Lobby, whose objective is to equalize access to power by allowing many more actors to have the opportunity to be heard by policymakers who, in principle, should not be conflicted, but should be there to serve the public interest. I have a few slides for you, not to be tedious, but just to make sure that I'm going to be short and sharp on a few messages that I think are important today. Where do we stand on the proposal for the upgrading of the European ethics system? Well, I would say the reason we're here today is because in the previous legislative cycle, we encounter some major hiccups in the confirmation process of a few commissioners. Some of them didn't make it. Some others were policymakers working for the European institutions and being authorized to leave the institutions for a few years and basically making the door revolve by moving from being someone regulating or being part of a regulating team on social media and moving to running one of the social media here in Brussels as a public affairs consultant, and similar revolving doors when it came to agency regulating industries, and then all of a sudden joining those industries with the possibility to go back to the institutions, because that's the magic of revolving doors these particular days. So all of a sudden, the public salience of those issues hit I would say, public attention. There was a sort of epiphany that we already lost because there's no longer much interest, as you can see in this room, for this issue. But for a few months, everybody was talking about how we can get this right, because it's going to happen again. And you know what? It's going to happen again next year, when in 2024, we're going to get the new European election, we're going to get top leaders elected, new commissioners being designated by the member states, and again, European officials leaving and just getting the doors revolved. So this issue is set to become salient again, so we need to prepare it. And to make long story short, we basically saw designated Commission President Ursula von der Leyen saying, I want this ethics body to happen during my policy cycle. Well, we are 1.5 years away from the next European election, and up to now, the only institutions who moved the needle is the European Parliament, that in a resolution a year ago basically said, this is time to make this happen. So we look at you, European Commission, notably in this case, Commissioner Jourova, please propose, put on the table a proposal that will create the conditions for the establishment of such an authority. The rationale for the authority is quite simple. We just heard that the European ethics system is basically a tale of ineffectiveness by design. The rules are scattered, the enforcement is fragmented, and there's no political way, there's no political appetite to actually enforce those rules by creating resources allocated to those institutions so that those rules become relevant and, norms have to become social norms, political norms, not just legal norms. Now we have a bunch of legal norms which read great, but they do not really have any major political consequences. So the challenge for people like us is to turn legal norms into social and political norms. This means new reflexes. That means a political leader that before entering into a meeting, before running for a position, before meeting certain stakeholders, is going to start questioning herself and saying, is it the right way of doing things? Are all the public interest, all the interests represented, including the public interest in this particular meeting? Is this move appropriate vis-à-vis public opinion perceptions? When former President of the European Commission, Mr. Barroso, decided to join Goldman Sachs after serving as a president for 2 mandates, well, he raised a lot of eyebrows, not only in Brussels, but all across Europe, with hundreds of thousands of people signing a petition saying this has to change. And this actually, thanks to a European Ombudsman investigation and recommendations, actually happened with a major extension of the cooling off period that has changed already the norms around that particular issue. So all of this means that we have a proposal on the table. This proposal comes from the Parliament, not yet from the Commission, but is very likely to shape the next, hopefully, moves by the European Commission. What we have in the table is a very simple idea. It's not a very sophisticated idea. It is something that basically says, well, why don't we put together all the existing competences that institutions have to control the integrity rules at in their own body together? So why don't we pull together without creating anything new? We just transfer all these resources to an entity that will gain public evidence, will gain public visibility, that will basically be more authoritative and create a practice that will potentially gain the attention not only of the media and public authorities, but also individuals. This is the idea. And in order to make this happen, as you can see, the idea is to give monitoring power. So this entity will have the possibility to check what is going on, in particular in relation to the most, I would say, recurrent infringement, which is the issue of conflict of interest, to have some investigative power, to have the possibility of recommending for sanctions. This is constrained because some recommendations actually can only come from the President of the Parliament and the Commission, and the treaty itself foresees the possibility to actually invest even the European Court of Justice. So the authority per se cannot do much more than recommending, but of course, if it does, this will create a new political impetus and a new effectiveness in the system, which is currently lacking. The added value of this European ethics body, to me, is pretty manifest, even self-evident. When you pull together existing monitoring, investigatory, sanction powers into one permanent and independent body, because now there's no independence. The principle is self-policing. Each institution basically checks its own members, which creates a lot of issues that apparently are quite common in the literature and in the practice across the world. And this would create potentially, this is the working assumption, some common approaches, a new administrative and possibly a political culture. However, there are already some arguments against, and my colleague Professor Schmuller already anticipated some of the legal arguments used to chill somehow the willingness or the political appetite to turn this proposal into something possible. And when you look at those arguments, what we've been doing in our study, you see that we are not really convinced that there are so many legal concerns around the possibility of establishing such an ethics body. The first concern is that this ethics body might create new rules, new integrity rules. Not at all. This is not the proposal. The integrity rules are there, they are scattered, they will remain scattered, but their interpretation will be centralized into one single entity. And this is the major added value. The second argument we have heard is that potentially there is a risk of interference between the ethics body and existing bodies like Olaf or the European Public Prosecutor Office or the Court of Justice or perhaps even the Ombudsman. Obviously, this is not the case because the ethics body would simply replace what these entities which already exist are doing, and therefore their actions should be coordinated with the existing prerogatives, which are different for each of these institutions. So the risk of overlap is virtually inexistent. There's also a third argument which has already been anticipated, the fact that decision-making power should not be granted to this institution according to a reading of the Meroni doctrine that seems extremely narrow and certainly not updated in line to the most recent case law, which basically says that at the end of the day, if these competences exist, and even if they've not been exercised by those authorities, they can certainly be transferred to such an authority, provided that the usual guarantees are respected. The instruments that has been proposed, that of an interinstitutional agreement, is also perceived as not appropriate by the European Commission so far. However, there are precedents that an interinstitutional agreement through a joint decision can also create an interinstitutional body. We mention a few of those agencies, including the European Publication Office and others, and the idea is to actually ensure a coherent practice that today is currently lacking. So to make a long story short, I don't see any major legal argument that prevent or would prevent the European Commission from proposing an ethics body that look a bit like the one that the resolution of the Parliament put forward. Perhaps now an update on where we are, and I'm going to come to a close in order to allow enough time for some reactions. The ball now is in the Commission's camp. We have basically a little year, a few months before the next electoral cycle is going to start, to see the Commission putting forward a proposal that has to be adopted by the College, that has to be debated, and has to be adopted potentially by May 2024. So time is really, really of the essence here. And we all expect to see the Commission to react, not only to the Commission proposals, not only to the European Parliament resolution, but also to the public debate that we are trying to keep alive with an event like this one, and that we are seeing in academic environment, in civil society environment. We see more and more interest around the possibility to move this forward. This is all from me. I'm going to stop here. Thank you.
Ora che abbiamo sentito
Now that we've heard from our experts who've explained and described their study in detail, I'll now give the floor to the NGOs to hear what their point of view on this research is and what the situation is at the moment on Revolving Doors.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Andy Agathangelo, the founder of the Transparency Task Force. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are talking about today is an extremely serious matter. We are talking about soft corruption, the kind of soft corruption that permeates every aspect of modern society. And we all know one thing, that if we do not take control of it, it will take control of us. So it is wonderful that this meeting has been gathered today to give energy to the idea that we can do something about this. As has already been said, whether there is or isn't a revolving door problem is no longer the discussion. The discussion is, what do we do about it? What do we do to make the difference that is necessary? And allow me please to be very, very blunt, ladies and gentlemen. If we do not do what needs to be done, the problem is going to continue, and it will get worse, and it will get worse, and it will get worse. And there is a very real risk, ladies and gentlemen, that the collapse in trust and confidence in our systems, be they political, institutional, or economic, will result in that dam bursting that Dr. Shmulo spoke about earlier. So the real question is, what do we do now? And I would like to spend a few moments talking about an idea that I think has some merit. And in fact, at the end of this brief talk, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if in principle you believe the idea has some merit. So either I'm going to be going home to Portsmouth today feeling very, very sad and very glum and depressed, or you might make me very happy if you buy into the idea that I'm about to explain. Here we go. You ready? The idea has its roots in the phrase, you cannot manage what you do not measure. And the problem we have at the moment, ladies and gentlemen, is that we do not have any data or any real metrics helping us understand what is happening in relation to the revolving door problem. What we can do together is create a violations tracker of revolving door incidents. This can be put in the website that is being created. We can co-create it. It is technically a simple and easy thing to do. We volunteer to participate. We create a Wikipedia-type dynamic in the database to bring together all in one place all the incidents of the revolving door problem. And we create an index. The index would relate to how serious is the problem. We can create some factors. We have some very bright academics here who can do wonderful things with ratings and weightings. For example, we can ask ourselves questions such as, how senior was the person involved? How quickly did the incident happen after the person left public office? What rules, regulations, codes and laws did the infringement break? Very, very importantly, what was supposed to happen in such an incident? And how does that compare to what did happen? And this speaks to a very, very important point, a point you already know about, the point that there is a fundamental lack of enforcement of the rules that we currently have. So we will be able to compare and contrast the difference between what the establishment should have done and what it did do. And we can go a step further. We can ask ourselves questions like, which institution, which individual was responsible for the underreaction to the revolving door incident that took place? Once we have the data, we can use some logic and some common sense. For example, we can start to track which organisations are the greatest violators of the revolving door issues. We can track trends over time. Where are things getting better? Where are things getting worse? Which countries are the most culprits? Which individuals are the biggest problem? Sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I genuinely believe that if we work with Sabrina and Jacopo and everybody responsible for the website, we can create a very powerful engine inside it to actually tell us what is really going on. And once we have the data, we can manage it, because it is true, I believe, that you cannot manage what you do not measure. And to my mind, this is the missing ingredient. It is as if we are driving a car without a dashboard. Let's build one. Now, I'm going to do something very brave here. I'm going to ask you either to put your hand up if you believe in principle this idea has some merit, or of course choose not to if you don't. Please raise your hand if in principle this is something we can get around. I'm going to be going a happy, very man. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Very good. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for organizing this event, and thank you for inviting me. Congratulations to the authors of the white paper for this important piece of work. So basically, I will be brief. I'm Shari Heinz. I represent Transparency International EU. We are the Brussels office of the global anti-corruption movement Transparency International. We work on our mission is to tackle corruption and to promote political integrity in the European institution, in EU policy internally and externally. So political integrity, as I said, has been always one of our main pillar of work, as undue influence is one of the main corruption risk in developed economies. Indeed, I will just take as an example the special Eurobarometer on corruption of July 2022. Basically, more than 3/4 of respondents, so basically 77%, agreed that too close links between business and politics lead to corruption. So this is quite clear. There is a risk of corruption when we talk about revolving doors. And I will talk about what we think as Transparency International is the main problem of revolving doors. The problem, as been said today, is that there is no effective monitoring. So basically, enforcement and sanctioning are not effective for both staff and non-staff of the European institutions. And even in case when we see restriction imposed as part of post-mandate employment activity, it's nearly impossible to the institution to follow up and ensure compliance. So I totally agree with the study where there is written that self-policing is broadly seen as a failure. So this is the problem, self-policing. The current system of self-monitoring and self-enforcement does not work. And scandals have shown this. There has been different scandals, but very recently this summer, as TI, we expressed our concern over reports that the former commissioner responsible for digital portfolio secretly lobby on behalf of Uber during a mandatory 18 months cooling off period after leaving the European Commission. So this kind of scandals have an impact on the trust of citizens on the European institution. This is why we agree with the finding of the white paper, saying that there is a case for a creation of a single, permanent, independent EU ethics body to reduce the risk of unethical behavior to a minimum. And basically, the EU ethics body is something that we have, as TI, we have called a lot for this. We did a pledge during the election in 2019. And now we see, as Alberto was saying, that indeed there has been the resolution of the Parliament, and now the file is in the hands of the Commission. And the proposal is a bit stalled now, but we think that we need an EU ethics body with sufficient resources and mandate to effectively tackle the issues of revolving doors and also others, of course. And we think, finally, I would conclude by saying that in general, we need this EU ethics body. We need stricter rules on post-employment, but also monitoring the effective implementation of these rules. And we need that for the next legislative term, because as we are going now, there will be the election, and we are going to see a lot of changes between EU institutions, other employers. So basically, in the Brussels bubble, there will be many changes, and we need these rules and an effective monitoring now. Okay, this is everything from my side. Thank you very much for your attention.
Se avete qualche domanda.
Are there any questions? Any questions from the floor? Thank you for this event. I'm an Italian journalist, and it was a great opportunity today, so I'd like to thank all the speakers. I'll have to be brief. I didn't raise my hand when the previous speaker asked to raise our hands, not because there's a lack of principle here, but because I believe it's a perfect and easily applicable principle. We should be able to apply this oversight broadly, and as well as collecting all this data. From what I've heard and all the speeches and all the presentations, if I understand correctly, there are two levels of actions that we can take. On the one hand, we have an ethical aspect for those who are not part of the institutions anymore, and the other level is legal liability, as the European Ombudsman stated. I think there were around 80 to 100 findings and files, because many of these officials are contacted when they're still in the institution. So there is a legal liability, because this puts at risk the trustworthiness of the institutions themselves. And then we have an ethical aspect. And the example of the dam is very fitting. The dam represents the European Commission, which, as has been said, is showing a deaf ear to these matters. But we do have an ethical principle that I believe can be implemented. And I think that the Italian proposal of the 2 years of freezing, sort of the before the move, would be acceptable, in fact, desirable. So these officials should be contacted before they leave the institutions, because we know full well that before they leave, they have access to a number of data that are extremely important. So we have this 2-year freeze that will allow us to tackle this problem. So I will raise my hand when, and I'm ready to do this, but we need to make sure that the European Commission agrees to this, because as has been said, it's not really very favourable to this. This is the problem, in my view. Until the European Commission accepts and agrees to all these proposals, to collecting data or just simply reacting efficiently, then in fact we risk not being able to move forwards. Of course, during 2 years, the 2-year freeze, many things can change. Thank you very much in any case.
Thank you, Madame. If I may, I don't mean to steal Mr. Agathangelo's thunder, but if I understand your point correctly, I don't think that the 2 proposals are in conflict. In fact, I think they are complementary. I hear what you say about the 2-year freeze, and this is something that has been deployed elsewhere. In South Korea, for example, the Civil Service Act requires a 3-year freeze. A person who works in a regulatory or supervisory role is not allowed to work in a supervised institution for 3 years, irrespective of whether that person was regulating the health industry and then wants to go and work for a bank. So if you regulate anything, you may not work in anything that is regulated for 3 years. But the point that you made about compelling or driving or encouraging a greater degree of enthusiasm in the European Commission, this is the point where I think, if I may say, I think Mr. Agathangelo's proposal becomes complementary. It is the exposure. It is putting into the sunshine why we need this. Once it is evident how often the revolving door takes place, it leaves the Commission nowhere to hide. And I think that's the power of the proposal. Mr. Justice Brandeis, who was a judge of the Supreme Court in the United States, his famous words were, "Sunlight is the best disinfectant." We've seen that in Australia, which is how I came to this study. We have had the most shocking degree of misconduct, of fraud, of theft on an industrial scale in our financial industry for 10 years that has gone unchecked by our lazy, feckless regulators. When that information got into the public domain, the cockroaches ran for cover. And so I think that exposure of the problem will go a very great way to moving the Commission out of its torpor, out of its reflexive opposition to what is happening. I also wanted to mention something else which I forgot in my address, and I apologise for that. I wanted to acknowledge my colleague, Professor Alamano. He has provided the thought leadership, the intellectual horsepower behind this proposal. And in terms of the proposals that I've looked at all over the world, and I was involved in the creation of an ethics oversight authority for our regulators in Australia, the Financial Regulator Assessment Authority, there are so many different ways in which those who perpetrate corruption look for an alternative. So the head of the agency whose job it is to make sure that our regulators in Australia are enforcing the law against the financial industry is a former bank CEO. And what has he found? No problems. It is that holistic approach that Professor Alamano and his colleagues have taken in the creation of this oversight authority, which impresses me so deeply. It is the reflexive opposition from the European Commission, which you can taste and sniff and smell and feel, reading between the lines in their response, which I find disappointing. And I think that if there was a violation tracker, it'd be very embarrassing for them. Thank you.
Just a brief comment on the question, complementing what has just been said. When you say that once a policymaker, be it a member of the staff or a politically appointed, leaves the institution, is only subject to ethical duties, well, this is not entirely accurate. It's actually subject to legal duties. And some legal duties extend and transcend the cooling off period. So that's the reason why there was a case that was raised against Mr. Barroso at the time, because despite the fact the then 18 months were expired, this gentleman was still subject to integrity and confidentiality obligations that go well beyond the 18 months and now the 36 months. So this legal enforcement, this legal obligation exists, but the question is, who should enforce those rules? And now we have a case, which is a case that is maturing, because there is enough evidence to prove the fact that a former commissioner had several contacts during, well, it was at the end of the mandate, after the mandate, and notably during these existing periods. To what extent the current commission and the current commission president should actually open an investigation in those circumstances, right? Because at the end of the day, if the mechanism is a mechanism of self-regulation, of self-policing, you also have a strong political component. Why today's commission president should actually hold accountable the member of the commission that served in 2 previous colleges, right? These are questions that are somehow unprecedented, but that the Neelie Kroes case that emerged under the Uber files raised all of a sudden and show that this is a question we haven't necessarily addressed. Very briefly on the point of the tracker, which always capture my imagination. I always think that peer pressure is one of the most interesting mechanisms, but I'm not sure that shame is enough. And I think this is your point. Shame might not be enough. We also need to create more than this. And what I like in your proposal is that you are basically arguing that the major rationale for collecting evidence and putting out there is not necessarily to trigger shame, but is first of all to gauge, to seize the size of the phenomenon. So to make visible what is not visible today. And this is really an argument that is used against pro-transparency, pro-integrity activists, as many of us are, because many people tend to trivialize, to basically say, hey, that's just a story. It's an anecdote. There's not really a pattern. And we always try to argue, no, there is a pattern. Those behaviors can be repeated, are repeated, they exist all across. And unless we have an evidence base, we're not going to be able to go there. And this, for me, is the major reason why I raised my hand. Because we need to seize the size, capture the size of the phenomenon in order to show that the response has to be proportionate to the nature of the problem. And today we're not able to do so. The name and shame, the name and fame can work, but just as complementary leverages for making this transformation happen, but not necessarily as the major trigger point, I think, to this reform.
Thank you. I really enjoyed your question. It made me think of 2 things. First of all, it made me think of the engineering fact that many, if not most, large constructions, be it a dam or a bridge or an aeroplane, the engineers, the scientists, they build sensors to listen, literally listen for stress in the system. And those sensors may say, this building is under risk of collapse, or the wings are at risk of falling off, or the dam is at risk of bursting. And the idea of the tracker is to give us those listening devices so we can hear as well as see what is going on. That was one thought that came to my mind. The other thought that came to my mind was triggered by your very beautiful jacket. I'll tell you why. I have 3 children. It's a lovely colour. I have 3 children. The second boy, Sam, when he was young, he used to get tonsillitis very, very badly. Very badly. And we used to have to give him this medicine called Calpol. In the UK, we call it Calpol. And it drops his temperature and makes him feel better. It's the same colour as your jacket. Exactly the same colour. As a loving parent, myself and my wife, we always gave him the medicine, regardless of how much fuss he made. The EU needs some medicine. The USA needs some medicine. The UK needs some medicine. Let us not let them talk us into not giving them the medicine because they don't like the taste of it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Buon pomeriggio. Sono
Good afternoon. I'm Arakaria. I come from Peru. I'm an Italian citizen. We see this trend of revolving doors almost everywhere, even in my country and in all of South America. Here in Europe, it is the first time that I attend such an event. I do think, and I believe that the European Union, if the European Union is doing nothing, because we are somehow violating privacy or your freedom of choice. Of course, we can mention all the concepts you want to live freedom. Of course, we know that we can use these concepts to justify our action. If you can do something about it, there will be a record.
Di riuscire a fare qualcosa.
Well, we hope to do something and to be remembered for that. Any other question? Good morning. I'm Francesco. I wanted to ask 3 things. First, your timeline to realize this project, and how are you going to fund these projects, and how we can participate as citizens to this project, as it was said before. The project will be an open project like Wikipedia. At least this is what I understood so far. So I wanted to know if we can participate as citizens to collect data, or maybe to participate in any other form to support this project. Thank you. Yes, of course, we would like to widen the participation. Of course, timeline and resources depend on the participation we will have on this. If we have many participants, including NGOs, well, of course, it will be easier. We will have to see how many participants will be in the project and then how to finalize it. I have just a brief question. I work in a small legislative administration in a region. I'm a part of the regional committee. I know that we are answering the needs of some categories and sectors, and this is prevailing over the general interest. We have these different lobbies, the fishermen, the farmers, and we are not really looking at the general interest. We ask ourselves, do we need register with all the lobbyists? because with the amendments and all the laws, we don't really understand what we can do. We have an environmental standard that somehow will favor the building sector. We even make an appeal to the European Union to have a list of all the lobbyists to have more transparency. I see that we have many critical points. Do we have such a register, and how does it work?
So maybe just to say a few words about the type of transparency register that exists at the EU level. It's not directly related to the topic that we're discussing here today, but there is such a register since I think maybe almost 15 years now, and it has grown to a register with around 13,000 or so entries. And only last year, I believe, the latest iteration of this register was negotiated by the three institutions, Parliament, Council and the Commission. And the Council, for the first time, participates in this register. And it's a voluntary register still for interest representatives or lobbyists, but it's binding on the participating EU institutions. So they have agreed, among the three of them, that each in their own way will make their interactions with interest representatives conditional on lobbyists registering in this register. And in the register, the lobbyists themselves declare, for example, their lobbying budgets or the topics that they're interested in. And as such, it gives you a flavor of the type of interest representation that happens at the EU level. And I think it is a very useful resource for journalists or politicians or people like myself when we are in our institution approached by a stakeholder organization and they wish to, for example, discuss a possible complaint with the European Ombudsman, that we can do our own check, so to speak, as regards who we're interacting with and what an organization may be about. And we, as the European Ombudsman, also make our interactions with interest representatives conditional upon them having registered. So I think if your question is, would that be a useful exercise for us to go through at the regional level, then yes, it doesn't need to cost much, I would say, to set up a register, and then you gather the data. And at the EU level, the data needs to be renewed every year. So interest representatives have to provide an update to their registration every year, and there's a joint secretariat that administers that. And if people from outside, observers, critical observers, see registrations of which they feel something seems fishy here, that may be either over-reported or under-reported, the actual expense that lobbyists have, they can express their views to the Secretariat. They can submit a complaint, and then the Secretariat of this Transparency Register has to investigate that. So it also has a certain. There's also some scrutiny, let's say, as regards that information that is self-declared.
Could I add a somewhat provocative response to that gentleman's question? And I add this response as a rhetorical question and in an effort to be devil's advocate. Can lobbying ever be in harmony with democracy? What is democracy? It is the will of we the people, and where the will of we the people is represented in the actions of those who represent them, then it strikes me as discordant, as something in opposition to the will of we the people whenever there is lobbying activity. Because if it isn't in opposition to the will of we the people, you don't need to do the lobbying, right? Because the electorate is asking for it anyway. So the moment somebody comes in and lobbies, they are attempting, I'll put this as a devil's advocate question, I'll make it a rhetorical question, are they attempting to move the duly elected representatives of we the people in a direction other than the direction that we the people expect them to move. I'll just put that out there. Thank you.
Allora, mi dicono dalla
Well, they're telling me we have no more time. I would like to thank all the speakers. Maybe since we have this research going on and since the Commission is not moving forward, maybe we can try to stimulate the Commission with this research. This might be a good idea. Maybe we can discuss about it with the authors of the research. Thank you for your attention. I hope it was interesting for you and see you soon. Thank you.